Testing 1, 2. Good. All right. Hello, everyone, again. We're just wrapping up the day. I know it's been kind of long so far, but hopefully very rewarding, and we have another great session for you today. So you may recognize the faces up here. They are featured on our website, on our faculty case studies. So today we are going to talk a little bit more about the projects they assigned, some of the challenges, some of the strengths, and then I think the majority of it will just kind of open up for more questions and have you just pick their brain on what worked and what didn't. So to start, I would just like to go around here and maybe just introduce yourself, what classes you teach, and the digital media projects you assign.
My name is Maggie Gordon. Hello? My name is Maggie Gordon Froelich. I teach at the Hazleton campus. I teach English 4 and 15 and English 30, the first year writing classes. And today I'm talking about the digital media projects that I teach in English 15, the first year writing rhetoric and composition course, I teach 2 digital media type projects. One is a podcast where students write about and then create a podcast based on an event in history. At the start of the semester, they choose a year in American history from 1945 to the present, and all of their research for the semester centers on that year, and they create a podcast. And then at the end of the semester, they work in groups of 3 or 4 to create an era in review project in which each student has been researching a year in American history. At the end of the semester, they create a video about their era, whether that era is the early 60s or the 20th century. Kind of depends on how the students have chosen their years. So that's what we're just starting to work on right now in the semester. They're in their groups. They're starting to do storyboards and scripts. And Aaron was here on Tuesday at Hazleton talking to my students about their project.
Good afternoon. My name is Vippy Yee. I teach at the Penn State Brandywine campus. I teach the Introduction to Sociology course, Social Problems, Sociology of Gender, and Urban Sociology. I incorporate a digital media project into 3 of my classes: Social Problems, Urban Sociology, and Sociology of Gender. My projects are different for each class. So for my Social Problems course, which has a large majority of freshmen in it, that's, I think, my simplest project, and that's a public service announcement. And that's centered around a social problem that they are working on throughout the semester, and I briefly talked about it in one of my comments earlier. That also incorporates a volunteer service project, or service learning, as well as a PowerPoint presentation. So that's part of a larger project. In my Sociology of Gender course, what I ask them to do is, again, in groups, they look at a specific aspect of media. So it might be magazine covers. It could be Disney movies. I mean, I let them self-select the topic, and then they're asked to critically evaluate how that particular media impacts our understanding of gender and sexuality. In my last project, which is in urban sociology, I asked them to do a mini documentary. It ends up being about 10 minutes long. And again, as groups, they self-select a neighborhood in Philadelphia. So it could be University City, or it could be a neighborhood that's in transition like Old City. And they have a very clear rubric of the types of data that has to be included in this mini documentary. It has to be socio-historical, economic. It needs to include relevant statistics, interviews with local leaders in that particular community. So I asked them to contact a local chamber of commerce, for example, and see if they can find a local business leader that's willing to speak to them. There's like a man on the street interview, and so this is a pretty involved project. I would say that that's the most challenging one. I also think for me as a professor looking at the projects, it's the one that I get the most enjoyment out of when it comes time to present them. And I also think that my students probably enjoy that project most, the ones who have done it and really completed it and done it well.
Hi, I'm Pete Froelich. I also teach English at Hazleton. And in addition to collaborating with Maggie on the projects for English 15, I've recently just brought 2 digital media projects into English 202C, which is technical writing. And one of the challenges in that class is to get students who are sort of invested in their technical language to speak to people with different levels of technical expertise. So their podcast assignment is to imagine themselves working as teaching assistants for a professor teaching a general education or introductory level course in their major. And they have to find a way to connect those basic topics in that course with some new or newsworthy or noteworthy research that's kind of breaking in their field. So it's kind of helping students to see the relevance of those entry-level courses in the professions that they're preparing themselves for. And then I also have converted the instructions assignment, which is a very traditional tech writing assignment, into an instructional video.
Is it on? Okay. Hi, I'm Terry Hartman. I teach Nutrition 360, which is disseminating nutrition information. It's basically nutrition education here at University Park. It's a fairly large class, about 75 students take it, and they're, for the most part, they're sophomores. The class is all about sharing nutrition information with others. So as one of the projects, we have a public service announcement that the students prepare in groups of 3 or 4. They do the taping, the video editing, and they upload it onto YouTube to complete their project.
Very good, very good. So you're all doing video projects and audio projects. I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about how the learning from those types of projects compares with maybe just writing a traditional essay. What is it about these assignments that really lend themselves to digital media, and how does it enhance the learning of the course material? Whoever wants to jump in.
Hello? Okay. Part of the reason why I decided to incorporate this kind of project was at my campus, there's another professor, Laura Gerton, who had worked with honor students. And she had amazing projects and decided to have a small little session with us to kind of show us some of the potential of this application. I came away with that and I thought, oh, this is great. I don't have honor students. Is this going to work for my classes? So I switched it to a group project because I realized that a lot of my students do tend to be students that have multiple learning styles. And I think it's really important that we address that in our classes. So especially for my visual learners, my kinesthetic learners, I think it's just another way to engage them with the material that they just may not really deal with as deeply if they were simply writing about it. And they do have to do some writing as well, because they have to write the script, they have the PowerPoint presentation in some of my classes.
I'd just like to follow up on that, because I think that that was exactly one of the things that I've found with a lot of these digital projects is that it does give more confidence to students who might not feel as confident writing the traditional essay. So that I think that those students who maybe don't feel as strong coming into English 15, don't feel as strong in their writing, do feel an ability to engage with the ideas and to be creative and to see that their way of thinking or their way of approaching the world is valued more. So that's actually something that when you were mentioning the honor students, I'm actually teaching 2 different sections. I'm teaching a section of English 30 and a section of English 15. And I think Aaron and I have talked about when he does the presentations, and English 30 meets first and then English 15. English 30 is often very sort of reserved and quiet, and English 15, they kind of are more rowdy and raucous, and when Aaron had them create silly podcasts, the first class was sort of very reserved about it, and the English 15, everybody was running up saying, oh, you gotta play mine for everybody, you have to listen to mine. And I've found that maybe English 30, the honor students who are getting told, instead of doing an essay, you're going to write a script, they're feeling like, well, hell, I have mastered the essay. I'm really good at this. And so they're a little more, I'm getting more pushback from those students who feel very strong in those traditional styles. And so as we're giving more opportunities to people whose skills maybe haven't been privileged previously, I think those who have excelled, who do know what we want, when we say write an essay, they say, how high? I think that it's an interesting dynamic that I'm kind of seeing happening.
I think one of the main lessons that I've learned from doing these assignments over the last couple of years is that there's really two ways to approach it. One is to go through the digital media first, and the other one is to start with what they know and scaffold assignments beyond that to push them in the direction of the new things. So for the instructions assignment, they actually had to come up with written instructions first, then a script and storyboards, and then shoot the film. And the way I assessed it was to make actually their topic proposal for the project, the written instructions, the script and storyboard, and the final video equal in their grading weight, so that there wasn't a lot of pressure on them to produce a perfect video. So in that way, I think what it did was there was the learning how to write instructions, but then there was that separate thought process. Now, how do I present this visually? What images do I need? What do I need to shoot? What textual messages can I overlay on top of the images to help people learn things? And I think in that way, there was a lot of conceptual thinking, both about instructions, but also about how the digital and visual media conveyed information differently from the textual.
In my case, the project really has almost all the components that you would have in a larger nutrition program. So the students have to identify a target population. Then they have to think about what is it that they can use that will be motivating to this population, and how can they include that in the public service announcement. Then they have to, it has to be concise, because most people can't remember more than a certain number of items anyway, so it's limited to a 1-minute project. They have to work together, which is pretty typical for nutrition education projects as well, and then they have to present it, and we evaluate it in class as well. So it really has all the pieces of a large nutrition education program integrated into this small project.
So just going along with what Maggie was saying, and how some students don't feel as comfortable with digital media assignments because it's a new type of expectations from what they're used to in traditional written essays. But that's from the student perspective. I'm wondering, from as a faculty perspective, you're venturing into this kind of new space where you haven't been necessarily always taught to experiment in this way. How are you kind of dealing with offering these new types of assignments when you may not be technically sound in all different aspects of digital media?
I've actually been doing this project for about 10 years, and before Media Commons was here, I did the digital, I showed them how to do the editing myself. But life has become so much easier now that I don't have to do that, because there were a number of things that could go wrong. Like the computer rooms would update the programs like the week before you were going to be there, and you wouldn't know about it. Or something would be removed from a computer or something. So I don't have to troubleshoot those things anymore. And I don't have to know the latest version of iMovie anymore, because I can work with somebody from Media Commons who does know that's their area. But I do have a good feel for what's involved, since I had to do it myself originally.
I've incorporated a project like that, like this, for I guess 3.5 years now, maybe even 4. And I have to be honest, I had assigned it for I think 2 years before I made myself do an iMovie, and it did give me a lot of empathy for the process. But before and after me having to do this myself, I really did rely a lot on Media Commons, frankly. I mean, I saw myself helping them conceptually with the project, from a content standpoint, and from a technical standpoint, I really did rely a lot on you and your staff. If they had questions, I made it very clear to all of my students how accessible your staff is, how kind and nice you all are. And I think, some of my students eventually get to the point where they realize, yes, I can really pick up that phone and I'm not bothering these people. So I've never really felt intimidated by it, but I am really glad I did the project myself too, or a project like it, to just help me understand what are some of the obstacles they may encounter.
path towards these assignments sort of took us from traditional writing portfolios to electronic portfolios. And then we were out at the Shenango campus for a couple of years, and they had just built their media commons, and listening to the presentation about what it could do sort of got us thinking. But then when we got to Hazleton, media commons consultants came out and sort of did a demo of GarageBand and iMovie, and I thought, yeah, I can see how that's going to work. And our best advice really for doing that is find an assignment or a course that works really well in its present form before you start thinking about converting. The other thing I would probably do differently would be to convert one assignment at a time, whereas we went whole hog and did everything at once. And I think there was more than a little bit of hubris in that, because the amount of lessons that we've learned over 3 years is really astounding sometimes. But once we decided to do it, we talked to our instructional designer on campus, and she said, okay, here's what we're going to pull from Media Commons. We're going to get the librarians in here. You're going to talk to them about library instruction to support this class. And really all we had to do was come up with different assignment sheets, and we were off and running.
I was going to add that a thing that really helped my project along when I started working with the folks from Media Commons is they had me develop deliverables. So you have to turn in your title, you have to turn in your task list, you have to turn in your sources that you are likely to use, you have to turn in your outline and your storyboard. And so where first when I was doing it by myself, I did have occasional panicked groups of students whose project wouldn't work at the last minute. But that hasn't really happened in the past couple years.
From my own experience and from being here a year, I've seen just the quality of students' work go way, way up when they do take the time to do the planning stages, when they are having a storyboard or a script, and they're sharing that with us and professors and with each other too. And so it's been kind of dramatic to see the creative and critical thinking happening before the actual technical stage. And I think sometimes we kind of jump the gun and have an iMovie workshop way too soon in the semester when they really should be more thinking about how this is actually going to look. So I was just kind of curious to hear about maybe where the challenges really lie. Do you think that, yes, there's that technical barrier, but then also how do you kind of teach students to work in the media form where it might be a little different form of self-expression than essays? So I guess my question would be, what kind of deliverables do you feel were important to get to that stage where they were telling, their stories or they're doing their assignment in a valuable way? And I open up to anyone else too in the audience. I want to get the audience involved.
I think that task list, even though it seems like it's pretty easy, that's pretty important because I give them a very detailed example with dates and people's names, and when I have them fill it out, I say, you can't just say the whole group is going to do it. Somebody's name has to be there, so if this doesn't get done, I know who messed up.
Yes.
So I have been working with Nancy Henry, who is the life science librarian, for a number of years, and actually in another class. And it didn't even occur to me until I started working on this project with Media Commons that this would be a good role for her as well, to come into Nutrition 360 and do a workshop so that they would learn how to use the databases to identify credible resources. And she talks to them about how to know if it's credible or not and how to correctly format them. So one of the deliverables, they have to turn in 5 correctly formatted sources that they are likely to use. And then the end of the final project does have to have sources on it as well. Does that answer your question? So I don't require them to use those 5 sources. They usually do, though. It's hard to know early when you start looking for that, what actually is going to get edited out and what will end up in the final video. So we review those and give them feedback on those, and there's credit assigned to that. But the final sources might be different. I don't think that they think that it's going to be easier than a paper. When I talk about it, I talk about all the various pieces and that we're going to be spending all this time doing it, and we're going to have 2 special workshops. So I don't think they think it's going to be easier.
Our English 15 and 30, English 15 plays the role at the university of being an introduction to research methodologies. And instead of having 1 or maybe 2 research papers, every single paper or other project in our course requires substantial research. And that, again, is scaffolded. So the first assignment, they do a kind of high school definitional, here's 5 or 7 things that happened in my year kind of paper. They're required to use print resources of a very general nature, encyclopedias and that sort of thing. And then we move them up through, say, a movie film analysis paper where they're required to use peer-reviewed journal articles. Then by the last project, they have all of that experience behind them, and they're not only bringing in the analysis from their research and their previous assignments, but they're also finding and credibly sourcing and also ethically borrowing as appropriate materials that they found on the web.
Why don't I just have Chris jump in here if you had a comment? You were going to say?
Is it on? Okay. I actually think that the biggest challenge my students have with any of these projects isn't even the technical side of it. I don't think it's even the research side of it. I think it's simply that it's a group project. And if I have a project that really doesn't meet my expectations, it's usually because the group hasn't worked well all semester. And so even if you've given them deadlines for, say, a storyboard, for a rough draft, or for sources, if that group is not meeting those deliverables all along, then the project isn't going to be good in the end, right? And so it's a challenge. That, for me, is my biggest challenge, is how do I help my students with group projects more so than with a digital media project.
I just want to follow up on that and say one thing that I tried to do this semester, because the Era in Review video project is their last project of the semester, what I tried to do this semester was to get them working in groups together and connecting at the beginning of the semester and have them work on a low stakes assignment at the beginning of the semester to see how the group was going to work and to try to establish the group dynamics. And I conferenced with them as a group, and we talked about, have you worked in groups before? And because I felt that way, that I'm expecting them to work in groups. I'm not sure I'm teaching them enough how to work in groups. I think it's helped for the most part, and I did have one group already where I didn't want to do this because you often have the more ambitious students sometimes will just say, I just want to do it by myself. And I don't want to let them do that. I want to say that part of this group, part of the assignment is to learn how to work collaboratively. And when you work in the workplace, you're going to have to work collaboratively. And I've had one group who I said, okay, you're on your own, because your group voted you out, basically. Because on that first assignment, on that first low-stakes assignment, one person just didn't work. And you'd rather have a smaller group work effectively than have a group that's carrying the weight of one who's not doing the work. But I tried to address that. I agree that that's a large part of the problem, is getting them to work in groups, and I tried to address it that way. So I think it's been a little more successful kind of getting them in the groups right at the beginning and having them kind of work on low stakes projects earlier.
So I assigned this type of project, or a digital media project, to 3 of my classes. And I'm fortunate that a lot of my students do tend to take most of the classes I teach. So I see some of the students come back and they cycle through. And what I notice, still speaking about like group work and even like the digital media literacy, is that I see a development. I see a progression in their ability to work in a group eventually. And then also with the technology, so that they don't get hung up on the technology by the time they get to the bigger project, which is like the mini documentary, for example. One of the things that I have been doing to try and address this issue with the groups is it's something very similar. So I do a lot of just group breakout sessions throughout my course. So just because of the nature of the kinds of things I discuss, we tend to have a lot of small group discussion. So I'm always asking them to sit with their group that they're doing this digital media project with, just so that they're building the connections from day one. And most of the time, it really does work. Again, there's always that odd group, and that's, for me, that's sort of the thorn in my side, is how do I, as a professor, kind of address that? And I would love to hear some feedback from you if you've got any suggestions on this.
Yeah, why don't we open it up to the audience to have comments and questions for our panelists, or just to chime in?
Plus is 75. 3 or 4. Because if, people don't really drop out of my class. It's required, they're all majors, and it's a required class for them. So I don't have that problem with people dropping out. And I want everyone to have a role. And actually, when their project is presented to the rest of the class, they have to say what they did, each person.
Anyone else have anything to jump in here? Otherwise, we'll just kind of wrap up the day, but feel free to comment. Yeah.
Well, what I used to do at the very beginning of these kind of group projects was I would do something very similar. I would basically say, I love giving my students a lot of freedom and choice and say, okay, how would you like us to assign the groups? And I began to realize semester after semester that most of the time they were really much more interested in choosing a topic. And so about, I would say 2.5 weeks into the semester, maybe 3 weeks, let's say for my social problems course, at that point they really understand what a social problem is. Conceptually, we've begun to kind of, use examples of social problems. So when we brainstorm at that point, my students self-select, and I think that does work very well.
My groups in the technical writing class were fairly easy because they were doing things out of their majors. It's sometimes a difficult course to teach on the campuses because a lot of them haven't done coursework in astrophysics yet. But we see a lot of the same populations. We see all the sciences represented, engineering, IST, and then a few folks here and there in other disciplines. So for the most part, I've had successful groups organized around sort of healthcare and IST, and the one group that really was the oddball group was the psychologist working with the astrophysics major. So they've had to pick sometimes less technical subjects. Like I think their instructional video was actually about how to choose a college to go to because they couldn't really find anything that worked. Their podcast was actually about the fear of thunder, which somehow sort of found some way between them. But sometimes you end up with the oddballs, but in a course like that, you can often arrange it according to their interests.
Mm-hmm. That's a great idea. Mm-hmm. It's a great idea. Well, one thing I was going to add is to bring it back to technology. So at one point, I think early on, I was more focused on making sure that at least one member of a team had some facility with a Mac, let's say, because we tend to do most of the work that in my projects on iMovie, and so it's Mac-based. But I've come to realize that my students pick up the technology really quickly. Like that's not a stumbling block for them. I mean, actually learning to actually use iMac and iMovie. So, when I was thinking about how to devise the teams, like I actually don't think about that at all anymore.
Very good. Well, I want to start thinking more towards the future now and how we can start to improve on these assignments because you've all experimented, you've done some work with digital video, and I'm just kind of curious if you could maybe conclude here by offering up some advice, some lessons learned towards looking ahead. Anyone else too? Yeah.
They're there already. I know mine are anyway, or I've seen them there.
I don't know if this is a lesson learned, but it is sort of where I'm looking in the future. In English 202C, we're always trying to get our students to imagine themselves as people writing in their professions. So imagine that you've graduated with your degree, you're working in this job. What are you going to do for a recommendation report, say? The thing that I'm interested in trying to do is to build collaboration between the faculty members on our campus and the students who are preparing for majors in those or related fields. So instead of saying to them, imagine yourself as a research assistant for a professor, what I'm going to try to do over the next couple of semesters is to recruit professors who want digital media components in their courses to issue requests for proposals to the students in my class and say, I'm teaching chemistry. I need a video that explains some process in chemistry, and then I'll offer those proposals to the students and say, hey, if you want to do a real project, not just a realistic project, you will collaborate with this professor, you will produce it to their standard, and all of the things that we tell them about, you know, the need for quality and professionalism of product suddenly will become much more real to them. Plus the professors will get custom-built teaching materials out of that collaboration. So I'm not ready to launch it yet because I'm still noodling it over, but I think that's one place where these assignments could go.
I was sort of toying with the idea of maybe next time I teach the class next year, putting all the PSAs together in a program so that perhaps they could be used with the morning announcements at a school or something. So maybe targeting childhood obesity or something, and having everyone draw a topic out of a hat, and that's your PSA, and we want these all to fit together at the end. But I'm not sure I'm going to do that.
I would say that, especially because of the conference, I've been exposed to a really different way of imagining these projects. And specifically, I think for my gender course, I'm starting to realize that maybe for that particular course, there are other ways to do the project, that I can incorporate some of these other tools that might better fit what it is I really want them to do in that class. So for example, I have an assignment where I ask them to go out and break a gender norm. And they physically do this. And, you know, not to humiliate themselves or anything, but, you know, to break the norm, to come back, write a paper about it. And I'm starting to think now, for some of my students who are really shy, like, this is a tough assignment for them. And even though I tell them, you can do this in the comfort of your home, you can do this with friends, I don't want you to really put yourself in a position where you're embarrassed. I wonder if I could use a tool like Extra Normal, where they could write out the scenario of what this gender norm role reversal might look like, for example. And then they could have the whole class respond to it. You know, we could have the whole class look at this as opposed to it being an assignment that really is one that's quite private, actually, and one where even though I asked them to talk about it and discuss it in class, not everyone will do that as well. You know, my more vocal students are going to, of course, speak up. But I'm trying to think of ways to use the technologies, the tools, to really reach out to some of my students that, again, learn differently, that have different personalities than the kinds of A students we're used to seeing, that are very vocal in class, very confident. So I think that's where I'm going now, is that I think I like iMovie. And it's not just that I'm bored with it or anything like that, but I want to see now if I can, you know, expand the tools that I use in my own classes.
I'm just really looking for ways to perfect the assignment that I've already created, because I don't really agree with Pete, who said maybe we should have sort of done this one step at a time. Instead of teaching a syllabus where I taught 5 essays, I went to a syllabus, you know, overnight the next semester. I'm doing a blog and a website and a video and a podcast. And okay, it was a really steep learning curve, and it really affected my SRTE to have made such a wholehearted change. Except I could have done this maybe over 5 years and incorporated one at a time. But instead I sort of did the whole thing all at once, which I like, but I can spend a lot of time sort of perfecting it. And I was actually talking to Pete in the car about this on the ride up, and I felt like with Matt Frank a couple of years ago when I first started this project, I was learning the technology, and so the emphasis really was on how to use iMovie, how do you find the things to put in it, and we're creating a movie, and that was kind of the focus. And what Aaron taught me was the creative side and the storyboarding and the script and how that is actually the most important. And so that's what I really want to spend a lot more time with my students on, and working on the different deliverables that Terry was talking about, breaking the process down to emphasizing the more creative aspects of it. So that's what I learned from Aaron.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to turn it over. Oh, we have a comment. Yeah. Who you were asking specifically? Oh, okay.
I don't really tell them how to develop their stories, but there are a number of theories for health behavior change that we learn about in my class. And so I asked them to pick a construct from one of the theories and at least include that in your public service announcement so that so perhaps it's a statistic that they use, you know, which comes from a construct in a certain theory or whatever.
Well, like we said, we adapted this from paper assignments, and we had them doing a historical narrative. So they choose a year, all their research is out of that year, and when it was a paper assignment, part of what we wanted to do was stimulate their creativity. So we gave them a number of different options. We said, take a real event and write it from the perspective of a character who was really there. So Martin Luther King's experience on the day he gave the I Have a Dream speech. Or you can create fictional characters and put them there. When I was at Mississippi, one of my students had an African American from Baltimore meeting a white lady from Mississippi who had come to the event, and their personalities and interactions were key to the story that got told. Or they could write a family story from that year, or with obviously real characters. What we found when we converted it to a podcast was that having that many options for the thinking and then having to deal with the technology made it a kind of unmanageable assignment. So now we say, listen, here's an NPR news story. Listen, here's a This American Life story. Pick one of those models and tell a story using it. That's it. So they still have some choice, and mostly what they're choosing is the story that they want to tell, but we're giving them two fairly standard formats to follow, and they're just sort of populating it. And that's in general our approach to English 15 is we're giving you an assignment that has some limits on it, but we really want to spark your creativity and let your curiosity drive the assignment.
For my mini documentary, for example, it's very similar. I have a pretty clear guideline sheet in terms of what type of data needs to be included, whether it's statistical data again or interviews, and I really leave it up to my students to construct it and give them that freedom. Now for the public service announcement, I usually have them really come up with their message. It all starts with the message, because that's what it's all about. And then supporting evidence for the message, and then I leave it up to them to be as creative as possible, and I really like that because I've had similar topics come up, you know, semester after semester, and to see the range of approaches is, for me, fun as a professor.
One of the things that I've kind of developed over my time here was coming to the campuses for the first class to go over digital storytelling and what makes up a narrative. So in a lot of ways, there's a lot of similarities with just, you know, writing a print narrative, right? Starting with the questions, having a moment of reflection, showing, not telling. The same kind of principles apply. The difference, I think, what I try to highlight is what happens when you translate that into images, or when you put sound with those images, and what happens when you put video. How do you ask questions and answer questions differently? One of the exercises that I really like with these classes is that I start with a sentence, and the sentence is from an old short story, that ends. This is the last sentence of the story. The last man on earth sat alone in a room. There was a knock at the door. And so I display just the print form of that sentence, and then I just display a picture, right? Maybe it's an old cabin in the middle of the woods, and then I read that sentence again, and we talk about how the meaning changes. Oh wait, now there's plants we can see in this picture. That means that the whole world didn't end. There's plants here, so there's still life. So ask new types of questions. Why is there still life? Why is he living in the middle of the woods? And then I add a sound effect, right? So maybe I add a really creepy noise, and the whole mood changes, or I add a very light, hearted sounding noise, and it becomes a comedy. So I think comparing different media and what they can offer to the storytelling process is really where the creative and critical thinking applies. So one resource that we're trying to put together is a digital storytelling type of maybe quick worksheet. It's on our website in the resources section where a lot of these exercises can be found. So with that, I think we'll come to a conclusion, and I'll turn it over to Chris to kind of wrap everything up. Thank you to my panelists, by the way. You did a great job.
Like I'm feeling right now, my brain is totally full, I think. So I don't really have too much more to say other than thank you so much for coming. I started the day by saying that this event was going to be made by you guys, and it totally was. The conversation was awesome. It didn't stop all day long, which is like how many hours this has been going on. It's just blown me away. So thank you so much. I'm really, really happy and really, really reinvigorated and excited about the future. So thank you, and thank you to Hannah for organizing this whole thing. So thank you guys.